Good afternoon and welcome to everyone. Thank you for your interest and time in coming to this session. We will get directly underway and I'll start by inviting Alistair Dixon to put up the agenda for the meeting. So in short, there are sort of two parts to the meeting. The first part, we will give an overview of the simulations that we've undertaken for how the wholesale market might work in a physical sense and with 100% renewable energy. And we think that'll take around 20 minutes. And then we'll pause for Q&A on that bracket and then move into the key issues that arise from that analysis. That we think that takes about 40 minutes. And if things go kind of along the timeline, we should have about a half an hour in the second bracket for Q&A. So the goal of the meeting today is to give you a kind of key points overview of our paper, which was put out on the 1st of February. We thought it would be helpful to do that because we appreciate that you're all busy people and some of you may not have had a chance to read the paper in any sort of depth. So a primary goal of this meeting is to give you a briefing on what's in the paper, and then to the extent that time allows, to engage in some discussion about the paper and Q&A. But recognising that it's a large topic and time is limited, and our primary goal is a sort of briefing session today, we are offering all interested parties the opportunity to have a bilateral session with us where we can explore in more detail the questions and observations you may have about our work. So if you would like to have a bilateral session, it would be with the presenting team today, then please make contact with Rachel Holden. And we've got some slots that are organised already that we can offer you to have that bilateral. So that's the structure of the meeting and our goals. So next I'll like to introduce the people who will be presenting to you today. So first I'll hand over to Alistair Dixon.
Hello everybody, Alistair Dixon. I'm Principal Advisor Strategy and Sector Risk. So I'm the authorities representative on the MDAG Secretariat.
Thanks Alistair. Stephen.
Yes, Stephen Batstone, independent contractor, helping MDAG and the authority out on this piece of work, particularly around the demand side and contracts market stuff.
Thanks, Stephen. David.
David Hunt from Concept Consulting Group, helping MDAG and the authority on the analysis and on the simulation work.
Thanks, David. John.
I'm John Cooley. I'm an independent consultant. I'm working closely with Concept on this project, mainly focusing on the simulation work that goes behind the some of the findings.
Thanks, John. And Rachel.
Hi, I'm Rachel Holden. I work at Concept Consulting. I'm helping the Secretariat with project management and also writing papers.
Thanks, Rachel. I think we're also joined by some of our MDAG members. I think Rebecca Osborne from Transpower may be on. Paul Baker from Nova was planning to be here. Andrew Kerr also from PowerCo. And we've got 3 observers, Conrad Edwards from MB and the Battery Project, and Ramu from Transpower. And we've also got James Tipping, who's now an observer on the group, who was until the end of the year, last year, the Chief Strategy Officer at the authority. So Tony,
I think we've also got Fiona as well.
Oh, sorry, hi Fiona. from Trustpower, newly named, is it Manawa Energy? So look, welcome everyone, and thank you for your interest and attendance. So we'll move directly. Oh, sorry, I should just perhaps bring up the next slide there, Alistair. I should just briefly mention that this project is part of the authority's energy transition roadmap work program, and obviously this is a fairly involved slide, but I think we have the top row, in fact, in that work program. But there's an integrated set of work which the authority has in progress to facilitate the transition of the market over the coming years. So that is available on the authority's site, and we're a part of that wider picture. So with that, I will then move to the first of the brackets on describing the physical nature of the market with a 100% renewable system, and hand over to David Hunt.
Thanks for that, Tony. So in this section, I'm just really going to talk about the question that we're trying to explore in this aspect and how we've done it. I guess the question we're focusing on particularly is how will the system change in terms of its physics, the fluctuations in supply and demand, as between today, the world that we're used to, and a world where 100% of supply is coming from renewable sources. To try and shed light on that question, we've done quite a bit of simulation work, which we'll talk about in a moment. Most of that simulation work is focusing on the world of physics, but there are some areas where behaviour comes into things. That physics, a lot of that is about weather. So it's about year-to-year variability in hydro inflows, but also within year variability, and variability particularly in wind and solar production. Simulation model takes account of quite a range of other issues, and as you'll see in a moment, with various different dials have been turned up and down. And the purpose of all of this is really not to have a forecast of the future, because I think we can be confident we'll be wrong. We're trying to do a point forecast, but really to try and understand the shape of the landscape. What are the directional changes that we should expect, and how sensitive are some of the results to variations in key input assumptions? As I said before, we're really trying to understand a lot better how much our system might fluctuate, and that's important because those fluctuations ultimately will have quite a strong influence on prices, spot prices. And so, as you would expect, when the system is tight, you'd expect higher spot prices, and when the system is well supplied, lower prices. You can have different views about the extent of those variations, and that is one of the key sensitivities that we've looked at. But nonetheless, in directional terms, that's we would expect there will be some relationship between those two, and often and therefore we are interested in understanding how often those fluctuations occur and how big they might be. If we turn to the next slide then, and just start to talk about the simulation assumptions, and then we'll come on to the results. So firstly, on the demand side of things, essentially we've adopted the demand assumptions very similar to the demand assumptions that the Climate Change Commission used in their central case in their report last year. This chart summarizes that. You can see the blue is the if you like, the base demand. The simulations assume that TY goes beyond 2025, so that base is excluding TY. And you can see most of the growth there is coming from electric vehicles, the green, and the conversion of some industrial process heat demand from fossil fuels to electricity. over the course of the projections, which when we've used 2 reference years rather than trying to do every single year, just the computational overhead of trying to do it for every year would be too great. So we've used 2035, which is a year sufficiently far in the future to say, well, okay, 100% renewables by then, what might the world look like? And then 2050, even further into the future, where essentially pretty much full decarbonisation has occurred. New Zealand's hit the net zero carbon emissions target. Over the course of that period, with the first 15 or so years, these projections see demand for electricity growing by 30%, and then over the next 15 years, another 30%, obviously compounding on a higher base. And so over that entire period, demand is up by around 75% in energy terms. Turning to supply, obviously with that demand growth, there will need to be a step up in supply. There will also need to be new supply to offset the retirement of fossil fuel plant. That translates into new supply growth of around 400 to 500 megawatts per year. And just to put that into perspective, that 400 to 500, I should say, is that's gross new supply. The equivalent net number for the last 30 years, which it's not quite apples with apples, but will be relatively close. There hasn't been that many retirements in the past, but the equivalent number for the last 30 years has been around 60 megawatts. So you'll get a sense of just how marked a change we're talking about in terms of supply additions being required. Other key points to note in this supply mix is the much larger contribution coming from intermittent renewable sources. So wind grows from around 6% today, and together with solar, that they're accounting for almost half of total energy production by the end of the projection period. Thermals obviously fall away, but not entirely. And the reason for that is that in these projections, there is an allowance for some thermal from biofueled sources, what are called green peakers in the paper. And essentially on the work that's been done here, they would be economic to meet essentially the last resort duty. So that the days when everything else is maxed out and there isn't any more wind or any more solar to produce, and the hydro system is working as hard as it can. Those biofueled peakers would be, on the assumptions in the model, be very expensive to run, but nonetheless, for those very last few megawatts, they become economic. We move on. One of the key things that, in a directional sense, we think will occur is that we expect more contribution from demand side flexibility. We've considered a reference case and then high and low cases around that. In terms of the reference case, it's in the same sort of ballpark as other long-term projections that have been prepared by Transpower and by National Grid in the UK. That flexibility takes 2 forms. Probably the most important, well, the largest in size terms is demand shifting. So this is principally smart charging of electric vehicles. So making sure they're being charged in the periods when, if you like, off-peak periods. But also the use of batteries, both at the household level and at the grid level, to try and smooth out some of the fluctuations, the very short-term fluctuations, particularly within a day. The other form of demand-side flexibility that's been assumed is demand curtailment at times. So at times when supply is very tight, a small percentage of demand is assumed to respond to those prices and to turn down. And that's not a shifting of demand, that's actually a curtailment. And again, we've done sensitivities with higher variations on the reference case for demand side flexibility. And as we discuss later, this contribution of demand side flexibility becomes much more important in the future. We turn to talk about the existing hydro base. So the headline there is hydro becomes the new thermal, and what we mean by that is today a very large share of the flexibility in the system comes from thermal. It's not entirely from thermal. The hydros also play a very important role, but just see there's a question there which I'll come back to. Maybe we'll take questions at the end. The hydro and thermal contribute today. Going forward with 100% renewables, obviously thermal is much less. It's not entirely removed. There is some contribution from these biofueled peakers, but it's very small in aggregate. And hydro essentially steps up to take much more of a role in terms of providing the flexibility to smooth out fluctuations in supply of wind and solar. This chart here is going to be familiar to a lot of you. It's often referred to as the spaghetti chart, and those coloured lines are essentially showing the simulated traces of storage across the year for 86 odd different simulations of weather years. The heavy black line is showing the average level of storage across the year based on historical observation, so that's actual data. And that thick grey line is the average of all of the simulation results. And key points to note are that that grey line is quite a bit higher than the black, particularly during the autumn period, so the period we're moving into, and also in the early summer. And essentially the intuition behind that is, in a system that doesn't have thermal and is relying much more on storage lakes for its flexibility, there is a need to have the lakes at a higher stage earlier in the year than they would be otherwise. And that simply reflects the fact that, you know, no one wants to run out. That's a very expensive proposition in terms of the costs it imposes on consumers and on the economy. And so it's actually economic to have more water in the lake earlier. And so that's why that average line moves up. A couple of other important points to note is that whereas today we're used to the idea that these storage trajectories to some extent can be altered within the year. So, you know, if we're on a trajectory at the moment and suddenly the rain stops, then the thermals can fire up and we don't go down the trajectory quite so fast. Or if the rain comes, we turn the thermals off and the trajectories don't rise so fast. Obviously in the future, without that big buffer of thermal, the trajectories are essentially tracing out the effect of weather. So the only things that really affect those trajectories in the future are the weather. Is it windy? Is it sunny? Is there rain or not? Demand, which varies a bit, but not that much. A little bit of thermal from the biofuels, but essentially the rest is weather and the amount of investment that's on the system in the first place. And in that sense, and the paper refers to this, investment becomes a bit more like fuel. It's important to stress here when we say that we're talking about fuel, not in the usual sense of, you know, you can order up some more relatively quickly, but in a very long-term sense. It's very, very slow delivery fuel, but nonetheless, that's really the thing that moves that grey line up and down. Finally, one other consequence of this change of having higher storage on average across the year is that we expect there would be more spill. Now that spill can take the effect of hydro spill, or it could be in the form of wind turbines which are able to operate but not operating, or solar panels which essentially are spilling their energy at times. And in all likelihood, it would be a mix of these things. And we would expect, all other things being equal, for that spill to increase. In one sense, that's an opportunity foregone, but on the other hand, the cost of building is always something that ends up being traded off against the cost of shortage. And because shortage is so expensive, it becomes economic to accommodate more spill. Finally, it's important to note that this is all based on essentially if you like, the existing hydro system. And to the extent that spill is occurring, there would be value in additional storage, and whether that storage is in the form of pump storage or other forms of storage, compressed air or other things. Lots of different things are being looked at the moment. And obviously there's an economic opportunity there if that storage can be developed at a cost that's able to arbitrage the differences between the highs and the lows. So that's really the physics. If we now just talk about what that means in terms of prices. So as I said before, we expect the system to fluctuate a lot more with weather in 100% renewables. And to try and get a sense of what those fluctuations might look like and what they mean for prices, the simulation model spits out price distributions, and this chart here is showing some of the summary results. I'll just explain what each chart means. So there's 3 panels there. They are measures of volatility of average prices over different time frames, the weekly average prices, monthly average, and annual average. And in each case, the ratio that's being reported is the standard deviation of prices divided by the mean. So that's a way that we use that, because that avoids picking up things that I feel like trend over time. We're really interested in the fluctuations, the volatility. And I should also say that we've adjusted that for seasonal effects. So we're really talking about the fluctuations relative to the average of the seasonal impacts. In each of those panels, you can see there's 4 numbers presented across the bottom. The first is history, which is simply the observed average over the last 20 years or so. And then there's a number for 2020, which is actually coming out of the simulation model. And the reason that number is there is for calibration purposes. So we've run the simulation model with the system as it stands today, really to test to see whether the model is producing results that look reasonably sensible, and indeed they were. And then the model's been run forwards with the physical systems as described in the previous slides for 2035 and 2050. And those dotted lines are essentially showing you the results for what we call the reference case, which is, if you like, the main set of assumptions, and then each of those other coloured dots is showing you a range of the sensitivities. I won't talk about the detail of those. Happy to come back with questions. It's all set out in the paper. I guess what I will just talk about is the thematic key takeaways. And the first is that you'll see there all of those results are showing quite a big step up in the volatility that would be expected with 100% renewables. Interestingly, that volatility is much more pronounced, that step up over the shorter time frames, so over the weekly average prices. And in fact, interestingly enough, it falls a little bit between 2035 and 2050 over some of those longer time frames. And essentially that's because the system is becoming much, much more sensitive over time to short-term weather effects. remains sensitive as it is today to longer term issues such as dry years, but that shorter term sensitivity is increasing over time. And it's essentially a reflection of the growing share of supply coming from wind and solar. And again, one of the interesting things that comes out in simulations is we're sort of used to thinking about high prices coming when there's high demand, or in the winter time. They can come at other times as well. But what the results in the modeling are showing in the simulations is the system actually becomes much more driven by short-term supply issues, what's happening with, particularly with solar and wind. And if it's dry on top, then it all multiplies together. Okay, and I think that is, I'll just double check one more slide, and this is just to put those results in a bit more of a context. So as I say, the we expect a much more volatility in prices, reflecting the much greater sensitivity to short-term weather effects. What this chart is showing is how these simulation results compare to actual observed volatility using those same measures in 3 Australian states and in Texas. Those Australian states and Texas were used partly because there's data available, but partly also they have a similar market structure to the New Zealand market. They all use so-called Energyonly design, which we'll talk a little bit about later. And you can see there, although the New Zealand increase in volatility is very marked, it's actually, and it would be in fact larger in terms of weekly, monthly and annual as compared to those other markets. Interestingly enough, in the very short term, the volatility within the week in those other markets is in fact quite a bit higher than what we expect in New Zealand. Having said that, I do need to just note a bit of a health warning there that most of our analysis is focused on the sort of week and longer. There are results reported which are shown in those open boxes for within the week, but they're sort of somewhat, there's been less attention on those. So just to be aware of that. With that, I think we can probably turn back to Tony.
Thanks, David. So we've got a question and answer slot now, just on the material that David's covered and related issues. So perhaps, Alistair, if we go back to the full screen, and if you'd like to make a comment or ask a question, please, if you can, use the digital wave function, and or just raise your hand and I'll try and spot you. Alan.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it was slide 6. I was curious to know what the y-axis units were, the demand response slide.
Perhaps, David, if you can refer to that just off your screen, we can.
Yes, I'm just zeroing in on it actually.
Gigawatts.
It's gigawatts, yes. So.
Okay, thanks.
Any comments or questions? Sam.
Yeah, thank you. Just interested, maybe if you could expand a wee bit more on the analysis has only looked at intra-week, if you like, and whereas obviously some of the variability might be very short term with intermittent renewables, and the impact of that on the findings and implications. Just a little bit more on that would be really helpful.
Sure. It's probably be David and John, but over to you. Who goes first?
Yeah, John, do you want to? It's probably you should lead off.
I'll lead off. Yes, the modelling work we've done has focused very much on that slightly longer period, sort of the day through to the week and months, etc. The reason for that focus in terms of our modelling effort is we believe that there are technological solutions to a lot of the very short-term issues around pricing and meeting supply and demand, in particular with batteries getting cheaper and cheaper over time, and providing that, you know, they tend to be relatively economic for operating on from a 1 through to 12-hour time frame, and that there's a lot of those short-term risks that can be handled through batteries. Whereas if you look at on a daily through to weekly time frame, batteries really no longer become practical or economic to deal with that, those sort of fluctuations. And therefore, those are the things which there isn't a simple technical answer for, other than the technologies that we've represented in our simulation, which are these green peakers and the operation of our hydro system to deal with those fluctuations that occur on that longer time frame. And it's mainly to deal with the long periods of low wind that you get from time to time. And if you retire all the existing thermal, the existing hydro that we've got simply doesn't have the megawatts to meet demand if the wind is very low for a sustained period, say over a whole day, whereas batteries can be used to sort of flatten out the effective load on that the hydro can meet, but they only have enough storage to last for a few hours. They can't deal with a dry period that extends beyond a day. So that's the reason for our focus. We're also aware that there are other projects running, looking very much at that shorter term time frame, particularly on the issues around security and ancillary services, and the challenging issues around coordinating all of these stored resources on that shorter term frame. But we haven't focused our analysis, this modelling simulation work in that area. Perhaps David, you'd like to talk a bit about that too.
Thanks, John. Actually, I see there was a chat question that Neville Gaius raised. It was the question, Neville, what time slice within week? Is that related to this point, Neville? You there, Neville?
Perhaps I could just answer it very quickly. The model that we operate, that we use, basically deals with a week at a time view of the system, and there's a sample of a work day and a weekend day, which are modelled on an hourly basis for work days and a 2 hourly basis for weekend analysis, just to make it's relatively easy and quick to do the runs. So that's the time frame that we're using in the model.
Thanks. I've got a thumbs up from Neville there. Thanks, Sam. Alan Young.
Hi there, thanks. So my question is with regards to the point about hydro becoming the new thermal. Obviously, with current thermal assets, you have peaking units which can respond pretty quickly to market volatility, or at least as quick as any thermal asset can. Are New Zealand's hydro assets able to respond as quickly to that type of volatility that we expect kind of wind and solar to generate?
Shall I pick that one up?
Yes,
David? Yes. Well, there's a mix on the hydro system. Some have reasonably significant constraints around their operation in terms of ramping, but a large amount of the hydro can ramp quite quickly, not necessarily as fast as some of the thermals, but then we expect that batteries will be used to provide that very, very fast response, or possibly demand side. So there's certainly the capability of many of the hydro schemes to respond very, very flexibly. Some of them have river chain constraints and other issues, and they all have limits at the high end and at the low end. At the low end, they have to meet minimum release requirements for their resource consent, so that there are times that you can't turn the hydro down too far below those levels. And at the top end, they're all limited by capacity. And that will be a slightly complicated thing in some cases, because you've got to have the water in the right places behind the right dams at the right time to provide the full megawatts. So that's an issue, but those constraints continue to operate just as they do now.
Thanks, John. Other comments or questions? John Hancock, you've got a comment in chat. Do you want to speak to that?
It's actually John Haylock, not John.
Oh, sorry, John Haylock. I'm sorry.
That's all right. Very similar names. It's easy
there you
to
go, John. Okay, go ahead, John.
Yeah, I just put a question in there around green hydrogen production, and that it's the idea of energy export, of energy overproduction, because if New Zealand produced more electricity than used internally, produce green hydrogen for export, that would have a whole range of flow-on impacts on the electricity market in terms of how you balance supply and demand within New Zealand. And I just wonder whether that model, which is being seriously looked at in Australia, EMO's got it in its official forecasts or scenarios at the moment, just wondering whether that's something that's being considered in New Zealand.
Shall I go ahead, yep. David? Yes, technically that's a possibility. Our enhanced demand side case includes a model of a plant of that nature, a hydrogen production facility of that nature, which is designed from the start to be able to flex. In other words, to turn down when the system needs, when the system is short because there's no wind or whatever, and to ramp up when prices are very, very low, and otherwise you might get into spill of either hydro or wind or solar. And what that identifies, that particular scenario identifies, is that there is some good system benefits for such a facility. And also there is the possibility for such a facility to, if they are able to provide very high flexibility, in other words, to actually turn off for a whole month if necessary, then they could achieve very big price discounts because it's worth such a lot to the market, that flexibility. So there's certainly the economics of that look promising from the point of view of a very flexible plant. If the plant is inflexible, then I think that would be difficult. And of course, with any of these hydrogen production facilities, the resources available, particularly if it's designed for the export market, they're going to have to compete with, very low cost, high solar and offshore wind and other possibilities. So there's a broader picture in terms of the economics, but from a strictly New Zealand point of view, it would be a great way of meeting those imbalances that we expect in the future.
Okay, thank you.
Other comments or questions? Okay, let's carry on to the next session. Alistair, if you can bring back the agenda, thanks. So we'll move to the key issues. And the first of those relates to coordination and ancillary services. And I'll hand back to David.
Thank you, Tony. So thinking about the implications of the various different permutations of 100% renewables. If we could go to the next slide, please, Alistair. One of the issues that we've identified is that real-time coordination will become a lot more challenging, and that's reflective of the fact that, as you know, electricity is unusual. It has to be balanced instantaneously between supply and demand at every moment of the day and across every location on the grid. And that will become more challenging, principally for two reasons. One is that a lot more of supply will come from sources that are not readily controllable in the short term, so-called non-dispatchable resources. Today, there's about 6% of supply from that type of source, really wind. And by the end of this simulation projection period, we're expecting that that will be roughly half of the system's supply coming from non-dispatchable resources on average. And it'll be much higher, obviously, at certain times of the year when demand is low and wind and solar production are high. So that will be an important challenge in itself. The other big change is that much more of the system will be distributed. And the analogy that has been suggested is, today it sort of operates as a bit of a string quartet. There are multiple players, but actually not that many. When you think about the bits that are kind of doing the heavy lifting, whereas in the future there is a lot more to coordinate. There are probably thousands of instruments in the new orchestra. When you account for things like electric vehicles that can be charged at different times, or batteries sitting in houses or businesses across the country, let alone solar panels all across the place and all the rest. And so coordinating all of that, we think will become much more challenging. We're not being particularly insightful in that. That's already been identified elsewhere in the world, and those sorts of challenges are already expressing themselves in a lot of other countries. New Zealand does have a bit of an advantage in that respect, because a lot of our, although a very sizable chunk of supply would retire, unlike most of the world, we actually retain a very sizable chunk of flexible supply as well in the form of the existing hydro fleet. Nonetheless, we expect that will lead to changes needing to be considered in scheduling and forecasting and dispatch processes, and also in the design of ancillary services, and that's already on the radar screen. The authority has, together with system operator, progressing a project called FSR, Future Security and Reliability, that is looking at those very issues. And so, as John said earlier, we think that'll be quite a big challenge, but it's on the radar screen, and will no doubt get much more attention over time.
Thanks, David. So the next key issue relates to the accuracy of pricing, and perhaps we can go to the next slide on that one, Alistair. So as we mentioned, our system is energy only, which means that there's no separate payment to cover the provision of capacity, and the provision of capacity is recovered from prices which are called energy only prices. And one of the features of the simulation work is quite strongly illustrated is the increase in volatility, and also an increase in the range of prices. So we're expecting to see higher prices. John will pick this up later. On average, we don't think in the medium to long term prices will increase on average, but there'll be more fluctuation and up to higher levels. And this will no doubt raise a question about the viability of an energy only pricing regime. And obviously one of the key policy objectives of energy only is to foster innovation and diversity. In our slide packs, we've avoided using slides with lots of words, and this is the one exception, because it's extracted from the paper, but it's perhaps helpful just to run through. And the reason, the policy objective of energy only pricing is to allow market participants to look for their best solutions for meeting the challenges of spot prices, and that might be on the demand side, could be through contracts or through new supply, but it encourages a diversity of response. However, for an energy-only regime to work, we think it needs to satisfy 5 key criteria. The first is that the prices reflect real supply and demand conditions, including very high prices in times of scarcity. And perhaps it's just worth pausing and reflecting back to some participants on this call will recall the 1992 shortage, which was quite severe, quite substantial, and it gained high political prominence. And the Prime Minister of the day established a review inquiry with 3 independent people chaired by the Chief Justice. I see Molly's on the call and Brian Leyland's on the call, so they're well familiar with that event. But one of the key findings and recommendations out of that process was that changes in supply and demand conditions and the costs they imply should be transparent and clearly signaled rather than camouflaged or suppressed. And that was one of the key considerations that went into going with an energy-only approach. So the first requirement is that prices reflect supply and demand conditions. The second is that buyers and sellers at the wholesale level have confidence that the prices make sense. And that is that they have confidence in the structure and the rules, including the sufficiency of competition. The third requirement is that there are tools available for wholesale buyers and sellers to manage their exposure. Fourth, that the public and politicians accept the idea that volatility and high prices that in times of scarcity are in the best long-term interest of consumers to properly signal those, and that measures to soften the landing for people who don't, or participants who don't hedge properly, can trigger a vicious circle which undermines investment in future pricing. And you finish up with a kind of a vicious circle of under provision, more high prices, and so on. And last, that it needs confidence among consumers and politicians that the investment will be timely. And clearly the last 2 of those, the acceptance that high prices and scarcity and confidence in investment, those 2 things are likely to be satisfied if you get the first 3 things right. And moving into this new world of 100% renewables and more volatility and a higher range of prices, we think could well give rise to questions about whether some of these conditions are satisfied. And we think it's an area that requires further work and consideration as part of our project. So the things that then follow from that are how do we think the demand side, contracts market, and new supply will respond to these high price signals, or these price signals in general, in this new world. And that leads to our next key issue, which I'll hand over to Steve Batstone to cover demand side and contract market responses to these price signals.
Thanks, Tony.
Steve.
In terms of speaking about demand side flexibility, I just want to acknowledge that in the meeting today, we've got a collection of people from the Innovation Participation Advisory Group here, led by John Hancock. So just want to acknowledge those guys here, but also that you provided some really valuable comments back and were part of the development of this work. So just wanted to acknowledge that and appreciate it. Demand side participation has been one of those things that has been a hope for wholesale markets for decades. It's often been commented on in the market designs about the potential for a significant increase in how consumers get involved in wholesale markets. There is significant value to the system, if you can imagine, when you look forward to the kind of volatility that David has outlined. There will be situations where getting consumers to respond will be at least a lower cost way of doing it than investing in batteries or expensive peakers. But, you know, to a large part, I don't think anyone would disagree that a lot of those ambitions haven't been satisfied. Although I do want to distinguish between what we're talking about today, which is about the flexibility of consumption that may be offered into the wholesale market, as opposed to that broader demand response, such as energy efficiency and conservation. And many would argue, and I'd probably agree, that energy efficiency has had its day and very much has been a big part of the evolution of demand side response over the last couple of decades. But we've focused on that flexible element as to the ability of consumers to change their consumption in response to wholesale signals. What hasn't changed much over the last 30 years is that the decision-making problem for a consumer as to whether they will vary their consumption in response to a short-term price signal, particularly on the wholesale market, is a really complex behavioural economics kind of question. And there have been tomes written on this and analysed across the globe. At the mass market level, though, the evolution of sensors, miniaturization of sensors, algorithms, communications and other technology, it definitely creates, I guess, an expectation of a lower cost of involvement for consumers in this, whereas previously a lot of devices that typically ended up in the third drawer down in the kitchen now come packaged up as part of the fridge or part of the dishwasher or the heat pump. Smart chargers are available for electric vehicles, and inverters are increasingly smart in terms of how they can communicate with the rest of the system. So that is definitely an improvement in the prospects when you think about that cost-benefit trade-off that consumers make around participating in wholesale markets. At the large consumer end of things, they have also benefited from these improvements in technologies that can enable demand-side participation. But we think that the prospects are very, very situation specific. So the possibility of a pulp and paper mill participating flexibly in a wholesale market is quite different to an aluminium smelter. The characteristics of the supply chains and the production processes are different. It's not to say there aren't opportunities for more of that, but it is very situation specific. What we actually believe some of the really encouraging prospects are probably in what we've sort of termed the new industries, people talking about data centers, and even John's question before about hydrogen production facilities, where we see those projects being designed with flexibility in mind right from the start. So the way in which procurement may happen or the way the plant is designed is actually being specifically catering for the possibility to respond to wholesale price signals. So that's really encouraging. On the benefit side, how the benefits are earned and received by consumers, I think, are really important. The DIY model where you self-manage and you put these devices in and decide to manage your own consumption, or let an algorithm that sits behind the device manage your consumption in your home or business, that's not going to do a lot for your electricity bill if it's a flat price over the day. So you do need a shape of an electricity tariff that's going to incentivize you to, particularly if you're talking about shifting stuff around, like consumption, electric vehicle charging, use that example again. If you're going to shift that around over the day, you need a lower price at one time of the day than another to incentivize you to do that. The interesting thing about the modeling that David and John have talked about, and particularly I think about the last chart that David put up, which showed the increasing proportion that intermittent renewables will make up of the system, paints a picture of a future where the price volatility over the day and over the week, potentially over the month, will be less about the shape of demand per se and more about what's happening on the supply side in terms of that varying price. So the classic peak off peak pricing tariff that might be available today may not be reflective of what's actually happening in the wholesale market. So the belief that those incentives that come from the wholesale market can be passed through to consumer, it sort of takes on a new reality there with far more dynamic things such as what flick customers receive. in some of those situations, and particularly because the consumer in those situations is making an investment in time and effort and all that kind of thing in response, in return for quite an uncertain benefit stream, may lead them to go, I would rather just hand the keys to some of my autonomy over my consumption over to an intermediary and let them manage it on my behalf. And this is where the prospect for anything from traditional retailers who face the wholesale price exposure on behalf of the customer, through to new flexibility traders, or what are called aggregators in the rest of the world that do this specifically as part of their business, comes in. And they do this on behalf of the consumers, and then presumably pass the benefit back. And that may be a benefit that comes as a fixed monthly payment, or it could be any other structure, but it may deal to some of that uncertainty about payoffs. So we think the role of intermediaries in this is absolutely critical. And when you think about the investment in systems and technology and capability that needs to be made at the intermediary end of things, it's no trivial thing. And even your traditional retailers today may not have that capability right now and would need to build it. And that's a non-trivial undertaking that may take a number of years. And for them to make that investment in building the tech and the capability and the systems to do that, they're going to need to see an opportunity on the other side. So I think the scale of the uptake of demand side flexibility on the consumer side is going to be of interest to the people who are building the tools and the tariffs to help it happen. And that becomes quite self-reinforcing, because once the tariffs and the systems are available, it makes it easier for the consumer to plug in. So there's a bit of a feedback loop in there that we think that dance is actually really, really important. Just thinking about what probably will drive the uptake curve from now until particularly 2035, which is the first modelling snapshot that David highlighted before. It's probably going to be in those devices in the home that are quite either energy hungry or can do quite significant things with your energy bill, and are major purchases. And so we think electric vehicles and solar battery installations, where the inverter can do some smart things for you, are probably going to be where the early uptake of that. So the fact that we don't have large scale uptake of demand side flexibility today is probably reflective of the fact that there's still only 25 or 30,000 electric vehicles on the road, and the penetration of solar battery installations is still not that significant. But as that grows, we think demand side flexibility will also grow as that dance between consumers and intermediaries takes up. We haven't identified any major barriers to uptake, barriers in the economic sense of the word. There are impediments such as the need for investing costs and things like that that I've talked about, but strictly barriers, we haven't identified anything significant. And in fact, some of the work streams that the EA has on over the next couple of years, such as real-time pricing and the dispatch notification product, may actually help accelerate some of this stuff. But that's something we're interested in getting your feedback on. Finally, in terms of the wholesale market needs for demand-side participation in the 100% renewables environment, the modelling that David outlined before has included both shifting your demand within a day and potentially between days, and curtailment, which is where you sacrifice demand and you don't necessarily get it back within any time. Both of those are useful to the system. Particularly shifting for that short-term coordination problem, and curtailment for those longer periods where the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow or it doesn't rain. But just on observation, the shifting is likely to be much lower cost for consumers, because you get to get your vehicle charged at the right time, presumably, and so the impact on your level of service is lower, but it's only helping with that short-term volatility problem. It's not helping with the longer-term thing. So curtailment is still something that the market will value. I'm going to move on, excuse me, now to contracts. In terms of the contract market, so shifting out of demand side flexibility into contracts, primary function of contract markets, as you'll find in any textbook you pick up on electricity markets, is to help smooth cash flows through time. And again, the modelling that David's talked through has painted a picture of not only just a more volatile wholesale market, where purchases and sales are going to become more volatile, reflecting the wholesale price. But also an investment landscape, which is going to be even more characterized by front-end capex than ongoing fuel costs, which is the case with thermal at the moment. So we're moving to a more capex heavy world and a more volatile world in terms of purchases and sales, purchases if you're a retailer and sales if you're a generator. And so that smoothing job of contracts to de-risk some of those investments it's led us to the conclusion the contract market will only have to do more heavy lifting in the future than it does today. But I would just make a quick comment. We did spend quite a bit of time reviewing the international literature on hedge markets and contract markets and how they might cope with very high renewables or even 100% renewables. And the literature initially appeared to us very scant. So we actually got in touch with people like Professor Paul Josko at MIT and Professor Richard Green at Imperial College London and others. And we said, have we got this right? Because it seems like there's not a lot out there that's telling us how hedge markets will behave under increased renewables. And the response was, yeah, actually, and Paul Josko was one who adamantly said you in Australia are probably at the cutting edge globally of what happens to contract markets as you move to 100% renewables. So no pressure, we're on our own. So the question we're asking is, will the contract market adapt to this higher volatility world with, I guess, lumpier cash investment decisions? One of the tools we used was to talk to a wide range of market participants, and the results of the discussions and the analysis is in a companion paper to the issues paper. And a key question we asked is, has there been a trend of improvement in risk management and use of hedge products and sophistication in thinking about risk over the last 10 or 20 years, particularly the last 10 years since the evolution of the exchange traded futures on the ASX? And the overwhelming answer was yes, we have all got a lot better at this, which is really encouraging. And even the majority of people said, we're going to continue to get better at hedging, the use of products, and the way we think about risk in the future. So that's an encouraging trajectory for the industry to be on when we think about how hedging is going to occur in this future world. However, our question is really, will the contract markets evolve sufficiently to deal with the kinds of investment and volatility that will be observed in this new world, particularly around you think about effective risk management for market participants, either building generation or retail load. So the first conclusion we tentatively came to is that it's highly likely that the demand for contracts, which we refer to as shape contracts or profile contracts, they're the ones that particularly target high spot prices or the retail shape, will likely increase. The demand for those products which insulate particularly retailers, but not just retailers, against high prices will probably go up. So the products such as caps, peaks and super peak products, you'll likely see an increase in those as a result of this higher volatility. So that raises the question of whether the supply side of the contract market will rise to meet that challenge. And of course, that has to include the transition out of thermal plant, which historically has provided some of that liquidity into the contract markets. That's going to be removed from the system and replaced by intermittent renewables such as wind and solar. So that provides an added layer of challenge to this. There will be new sources of firming, and in the modelling, while hydro is doing a huge amount of the work around firming, the modelling also includes green peakers. They will continue to be sources of liquidity, but we also wonder whether the distributed energy resources, and again, this is a focus for IPAG, will distributed energy resources such as batteries and demand-side flexibility, can they actually become part of the liquidity landscape for the supply of contracts, because they have a degree of firmness to them, and in some situations resembles a cap product to some degree. And also with the changes in the shape of price distributions, and therefore the changes in the nature of risk as we transition from where we are today into a 100% renewables future that David's painted a picture of, people's understanding of risk and how much value they put on risk management is going to be one of the key factors on whether the trades are going to happen between willing buyer and willing seller in the contract market. So because those price distributions will change, there'll be an information symmetry question there. But at the same time, if volatility is increasing, then volatility is actually going to be more in your face more often, particularly as we get more intermittent renewables in here. So that could lead to people being more used to the risk or more aware of the risk is probably a better way of saying it, and therefore more likely to trade in these products. But that's definitely something we need to consider further as part of the options phase. And that is the end of my two things. Tony.
Thanks, Stephen. So the next key issue is how the investment, in particular new supply side of the market, responds. Over to you, David.
Okay. Very briefly, the talk before about the big step up that we expect to occur in electricity demand over time, and also the need to replace thermal, fossil thermal as it retires. Together they create a big demand for new supply, something like 400 to 500 megawatts a year on average. And as I mentioned, that compares to sort of around 60 megawatts in net terms over the last 30 odd years. Making those investments at the right type of investment in the right place at the right time is, we think, probably the single largest contribution that the sector is likely to make to keeping down electricity costs for New Zealand. And when I say the right type, that's including batteries and network services and the wider supply side of things, I should say. And one of the certainly as far as generation and related assets are concerned, one of the aspects of the current design is that those risks are essentially placed on project sponsors. So if someone invests in generation and it turns out it's not a particularly good investment because it's in the wrong place or didn't come in on time or budget, then the cost of that essentially falls on the developer. And that creates quite a strong discipline against poor project selection and execution, and investing in things that are not needed. Having said that, there is also it relies on there being adequate investment incentives, and that in turn links back to the question around forward contracts that Steve talked about earlier. The related issue is that that also requires that there is competition among potential investors. The reason people invest is, rather than waiting, is because they're afraid someone else will eat their lunch. And so you have to believe that there is enough competition for that to occur. If there's only one investor, then they can, to some extent, dictate the timing. And so we think investment is one of the key issues that flows from the thinking about the future and thinking about the incentives to ensure both efficient and timely investment will be a key issue going forward, and something that deserves a bit more thinking about. Back to you, Tony.
Thanks, David. So the last of the key issues relates to competition, and it's probably an issue that's occurred in the discussion of the previous issues, but we think it's an issue in itself, and that is whether there will be sufficient competition in a market with 100% renewables to provide the necessary ongoing disciplines on prices and costs across the relevant timeframes. That is from the hour to longer term new investment across the spectrum. And we think it's an issue that will require further deep analysis, which we propose to do in our next stage. But I'll hand back to David just to comment on the initial findings from the work to date.
Thanks, Tony. As you'll see in the paper, this is an area where we've really only scratched the surface at this point. But what we've identified is we think in some areas the move to 100% renewables may well strengthen competition, and that's particularly where new technologies can have quite an impact. And batteries is a good example of that, where batteries should be able to actually improve competition at the very short-term end of the flexibility spectrum, so within day flexibility, but also in some of the ancillary services spaces. On the other hand, we also think that there may well be a thinning of competition in some other segments of the thinking about the sort of spectrum of services that are provided, and probably the key one there that's kind of identified at this point is really the sort of flexibility within year, thinking about things like seasonal services, where thermal plant currently play a major role in providing that flexibility, and as fossil fuel thermals retire, then obviously that source of supply diminishes, and all other things being equal, there's an increase in competition, increase in concentration among suppliers. And particularly when you think about the flexible part of the hydro base, a lot of that flexibility is associated with a relatively small number of reservoirs. And so there's a question mark about what that means in terms of competition, both in the sort of physical sense for those services, but also the effect that that has on the contract market, and in turn the ability of that to affect other parts of the supply chain. Having said that, it's not necessarily straightforward. There are quite a number of moving parts to think about, and so that's why we think it's an issue that needs to be looked at more closely in the next phase.
Thanks, David. So we've now reached the second bracket for questions, and we in fact have closer to 45 minutes than 20 minutes. So if we pull the screen back up, Alistair, and invite comments and questions from all participants. Clear. Oh, disappeared, right?
Alex, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, perfect. So this is just going back to the section on demand flexibility. So Stephen, you spoke about the lack of success of what I call like a passive demand flex approach. So getting people to reduce consumption in response to high prices, which we agree is very hard to make work either through retail contracts or sort of direct purchasing, dispatch approaches. Given that, have you considered a model that enables customers directly or flex providers to sell demand response in response to price instead of buying load in response to price? While they sound the same, they're very different propositions for the businesses providing those services, and also it's very different proposition for the customer. So I'm talking about models like the wholesale demand response mechanism in Australia, megawatt trading in Japan. I think they've got a similar model in Singapore, and then various markets throughout Europe and the US. Also, have seen much greater success in getting demand flexibility by allowing people to sell demand response rather than buy load in response to price.
Yeah, great point, Claire. And of all the ones you listed, the only one I had looked at in any detail was Australia's wholesale demand response scheme. And it would be really interesting to talk to you in a bit more detail about your views on that, which we can do as a bilateral offline. Because when we get to the options stage, that might be the kind of mechanism that we look at to see what problem would that solve, and would it be useful to our approach to 100% renewable. So I think you're absolutely right to raise them, and I'm interested in continuing that conversation. Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. Let's do that. Thanks.
Scott.
Yeah, thanks. Really interesting. And I was just wondering about the value of collaboration, actually, because you've talked a lot about competition, but we can see lessons from the EU where there's been regulatory changes that have enabled community energy in particular to exist. And that space seems to create a bit of well, more cooperation and collaboration, sharing of experiences, sharing of risk, and an understanding of the sector that ends up providing a bit more competition to the traditional industry, but also brings in innovation, flexibility, and more resilience for community energy systems and for energy systems in general. So I'm wondering whether competition is the best lens to put on this, and whether we might be overlooking what needs to be there, which is a bit more of a collaborative approach with the industry, in particular when we're developing the national energy strategy.
Stephen, do you want to pick that up?
I can have a crack, but I'd be interested in David's view as well, given he talked about competition. Yeah, I mean, I agree. There's definitely a different culture, and the political culture in the EU's quite different to New Zealand, but there are a lot of lessons to be learned there. Obviously, the collaboration thing's limited by Commerce Act and things like that in New Zealand, which we have to be careful around. But if you tie that down to community energy schemes, I think there are, significant opportunities at that scale, community scale, or even bigger regional scale to work together, particularly since a lot of the supply chains for the resources are common, and the infrastructure constraints might be common. The slice and dice approach of individual small projects, each trying to vie for distribution network capacity or supply chain capacity, is not a way you're going to get fast uptake of a lot of this stuff. So at that level, yeah, definitely agree that that could be a good way forward. Yeah.
Maybe if I just add a comment, Tony.
Sure, go ahead.
I mean, I think, competition, collaboration, to some extent, they sort of, they sound like opposites, but I, to my mind, cooperation among some people to compete with the existing suppliers is another form of competition, maybe. But so we may be talking about the same thing using different labels. One thing I should have mentioned before that's quite important in this is the, which I'm sure you're very well aware of, is a lot of these new technologies are efficient at much smaller scales. So I think that's part of the reason it does open up a much bigger spectrum of potential suppliers. And that again is one of the reasons that we think the coordination issue starts to change. It's not just coordinating a handful of big sets of resources. There's a lot more different players in the system. And I guess beyond that, I think I probably can't add much. I'd be interested in your views and submissions from others on how to get the best out of all of the various different opportunities in that space.
Thanks, Scott. Sorry, Neville, go ahead.
Right, I hope this is working. Can you hear me?
Yep.
That's a good start. Just a follow-on question, really, same track, I think, as Claire's earlier question. I guess in a future where demand flex is such a significant element of these, if you like, supply and demand mix, I'm assuming that in the simulation modelling, you've assumed it's been offered in at some kind of price structure. So, that effectively, if you like, the megawatts are being offered in almost like a thermal generator, and that those are helping with price discovery. And really the question is, and I imagine it's one to continue thinking about, is how important is that in terms of price discovery for an energy-only market design? If you have participants, if you like, privately reacting to price signals, but never actually signaling what those reactions will be, does that leave you with a too thin market for Energyonly to work sensibly?
I'm happy to just pick up the first bit of that, but David and John may want to comment on the exact assumptions in the modelling, which you might be interested in, Neville. But yeah, I totally agree. And you know, the dispatch notification product that will be introduced a few months after RTP goes live, 2023, I think it is, Alistair, is trying to target exactly that. You're not just getting a sort of a passive off-market response to a wholesale price. You're actually indicating every 5 minutes into the market what your willingness to do that is. And the authority has been quite clear that its motivation for that is exactly the point you made, that you get price discovery as a result. If it doesn't indicate a price to the market, you're obviously still getting a benefit because you actually do then moderate. But the value of price discovery, which has been true since the early dawn of market design, this kind of thing, is that particularly when you get into those scarcity situations, if you're going to rely on administrated pricing to indicate scarcity, that's where a lot of the political nervousness comes in. But if you can have actual consumers saying, here's how much it's worth to me at this point in time, it adds a degree of political credibility to the prices that you see coming out of the market. So you go from non-price rationing to price rationing. So yeah, I agree. I do think it's important.
Thanks, Neil.
Thanks a lot.
Got a chat thing here. Catherine, do you want to put your question?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's completely not related to the most recent part of the conversation, but earlier on it struck me as we were talking about the future options of EVs to be used as, you know, thousands of mini storage solutions everywhere popping back into the market. Anecdotally, I believe that some EVs are better at this than others, and potentially it's an issue for batteries and ranges. And I just wonder about how confident we can be in the capability of batteries within EVs to have a highly engaged role in the energy system. I don't know enough about it, so just wondered if you guys could talk me through what you know in this space.
Want to go ahead, Stephen?
Yeah, I'll have a crack. It's hilarious that with guys like Alan Miller and Glenn Coates on the call that I'm going to talk about this, but I'm going to say very little, and it might be cheeky to throw it to those guys. But
you could also just hook into that Norway experience that we were.
Well, that's true. I will chat about Norway experience, but Catherine, my personal experience is more at the grid scale batteries, and the comment I would make at grid scale is that the manufacturers are getting more confident about the number of cycles you can put through those batteries. When they were first getting released, the lithium-ion ones, they were very, very conservative in their warranties about how many cycles you go before you degrade the batteries. But at the car level, I mean, you can see it if you drive a Leaf as to how much the charge goes. And I presume that the smartness of the charging is doing it in an optimal fashion that preserves as much of the battery life as possible. But others would be better placed to comment on the technical thing. But to Tony's point, one of the things that gives a hint to the type of cycling you might see we got was from the Norwegian experience. It's going on right now. Norway's, or has been over the last year or so, had low lake levels and also was caught up because they're interconnected to Europe in the low wind environment. And they had, because consumers are there on spot, they had sort of a trebling or quadrupling in residential household prices. And what it spurred was an uptake of smart charging and electric vehicles. And the consumer could tell their retailer, it was actually the retailers who was driving this, the consumer could say to their retailer, I want my car charged by 8 o'clock in the morning because that's when I take the kids to school. Outside of that, you can use up to X percent, and X typically was only 30 or 40% of the charge current and the battery storage. So how much of that was advice from the battery manufacturer and by the consumer was another thing, but they offered the consumer quite a lot of precision over how much of their car's storage capability they wanted to hand over to someone else to do smart things with. So that might, just in the design of the arrangement, might actually mitigate some of what you're talking about.
Then, yeah, the requirement was a certain level of charge ready by sort of 7:30 in the morning, and but it wasn't just retail, or it's not just retailers. Obviously, it's spurred the emergence of aggregators that are independent of retailers, hasn't it? That are becoming a bit of a feature of the market there.
Globally, yeah, but in Norway, you know, the person we were talking to there, Gavin, indicated it was the retailers who first picked up the ban.
Right.
There has been the emergence of a couple of aggregators who are specifically targeting that market and saying we're the best in the business at playing with your battery in your electric vehicle. Yep, that's true.
Yeah. So if there are others who have expertise on the specifics of car battery rechargeability, feel free to comment. But
maybe John can let us know how his fancy Tesla's going.
Yeah. Look, we've got a question here from Peter McAllister of Meridian. Peter, do you want to put your question? Maybe Peter's dropped off. All right, we'll move past that. So any other questions or comments? We won't prolong this if people are sated and satiated. All righty, well, let's, thank you all for your attendance and interest. We would be pleased, as I say, to have any follow-up bilateral discussions with anyone who may be interested. We are particularly interested in helping you obtain any information you might need for your submissions. And our goal is to gauge whether there's a meeting of minds around the particular issues that we should zero in on and develop options for to better enable the effective operation of a world with 100% renewable supply. So our next stage will be zeroing in on the issues that we think are key in developing options. We'll put out a paper with those options later this year, and that in turn will lead to a third stage and final paper to the authority with recommendations on changes that should be made to the market design to better enable 100% renewable electricity supply. So with that, I'll call the meeting to a close and thank you very much.
Thanks all.